Nobody teaches you how to think about money. They teach you how to calculate it, how to budget it, how to invest it in a technical sense. But nobody sits you down and explains why smart people make terrible financial decisions, why brilliant economists go bankrupt, why lottery winners end up broke within 5 years, why the person earning half your salary somehow retires wealthier than you do, why knowing the right thing to do with money and actually doing it are two completely different skills that have almost nothing to do with each other. The answer is not intelligence. It is not education. It is not access to information. Because we live in the most information-rich era in human history, and people are still making the same financial mistakes they have always made. The answer is psychology, the way you think about money, the beliefs you formed about it before you were old enough to question them, the emotional patterns that drive your financial decisions in ways you are often completely unaware of, the stories you tell yourself about what money means, what it says about you, and what it will do for you when you finally have enough of it. In 2020, Morgan Housel published a book that addressed all of this with a clarity, an honesty, and a depth of insight that the financial world had been waiting for without knowing it. The book is called The Psychology of Money. It has sold over 4 million copies. It has been translated into over 50 languages. And it has changed the way millions of people think not just about their bank accounts, but about their entire relationship with wealth, risk, time, and the stories they tell themselves about all of it. Housel is not a typical financial writer. He does not give you stock tips. He does not tell you which index funds to buy or what your asset allocation should be at 45. What he does instead is far more valuable. He tells you the truth about why financial decisions are almost never purely financial, why they are always, at their core, deeply human, and why understanding the human element is the most important financial education you will ever receive. The book is organized as 19 short chapters, each one exploring a different aspect of the psychology of money. We are going to move through the most powerful ideas in a way that builds on itself, so that by the end, you have not just a collection of insights, but a genuinely new framework for thinking about wealth, behavior, and the life you are trying to build. Let us start with the foundational idea that Housel uses to open the entire book, the idea that no one is crazy. He tells the story of two very different Americans. The first is a man who grew up during the Great Depression. He watched banks fail. He watched his neighbors lose everything. He watched people stand in soup kitchen lines. The emotional imprint of that experience shaped every financial decision he made for the rest of his life. He hoarded cash. He avoided stocks. He was terrified of debt. To someone who grew up in the post-World War II prosperity of the 1950s and 60s, his behavior looked irrational, paranoid, overly conservative, to the point of self-sabotage. But was he crazy? Housel says no. He was responding rationally to the world he had experienced. His financial behavior made perfect sense given his personal history. And here is the insight that everything else in the book builds on. Every person's relationship with money is shaped by their unique personal history. The era they grew up in, the family they grew up in, the specific experiences, both good and bad, that formed their intuitions about what money means and how the world works. And no two people have the same history, which means no two people have the same relationship with money, which means the financial decision that looks obviously correct to you might look obviously wrong to someone else. And you are both being rational. You are just being rational about different experiences. This is why financial arguments are so often completely unproductive. You are not disagreeing about facts. You are disagreeing about the worlds you each grew up in. And until you understand that, you will keep talking past each other forever. The practical implication is profound. Before you judge someone else's financial behavior, try to understand the experiences that shaped it. And before you judge your own, try to honestly examine where your intuitions came from. Are your beliefs about debt, about risk, about saving, about investing actually based on a clear-eyed assessment of your current reality? Or are they echoes of a world you no longer live in? Now let us talk about one of the most powerful and most misunderstood forces in all of personal finance. Housel calls it the greatest force in investing, and most people dramatically underestimate it. It is compounding. He tells the story of Warren Buffett to make this point in a way that is genuinely shocking once you see it clearly. Buffett's net worth is approximately $90 billion. Of that $90 billion, $84.5 billion was accumulated after his 52nd birthday. He has been a skilled investor since he was 10 years old, but the overwhelming majority of his wealth came not from his skill, but from the time that skill had to compound. Housel makes the comparison to a contemporary of Buffett's named Jim Simons, who runs the hedge fund Renaissance Technologies. Simons has compounded money at roughly 66% annually since 1988, which is almost 3 times better than Buffett's long-term average. But Simons is worth $21 billion, roughly a quarter of Buffett's wealth. Because Simons did not get serious about investing until his mid-40s, he had fewer decades for his returns to compound. The math of compounding rewards duration above almost everything else. Buffett's secret is not that he is a better investor than everyone else. It is that he has been a very good investor for an extraordinarily long time. The lesson here is not complicated, but it is almost universally ignored. The most powerful financial decision most people can make is to start early and stay consistent. Not to find the best investment, not to time the market, not to chase the highest returns, but to give time the opportunity to do what only time can do. To let compounding work its slow, invisible, almost unimaginable magic across decades. Housel says the counterintuitive conclusion of compounding is that good investing is not about earning the highest returns. It is about earning pretty good returns, kept up for the longest period of time. The tortoise and the hare, applied to finance with mathematical precision. Now let us talk about something that Housel considers one of the most important concepts in the book. He calls it getting wealthy versus staying wealthy, and he argues that these two skills are completely different from each other, require completely different behaviors, and are almost never discussed together. Getting wealthy requires optimism. It requires risk-taking. It requires putting yourself out there, making concentrated bets, being willing to fail, and trying again. The people who build wealth from scratch are almost always people who took significant risks at critical moments. They started the business when the outcome was uncertain. They made the investment when it was not obvious. They backed themselves when no one else would. Optimism and risk tolerance are the engines of wealth creation. Staying wealthy requires almost the opposite. It requires a recognition that what worked before will not necessarily work again. It requires a genuine fear of losing what you have built. It requires a kind of paranoia about downside risk that looks almost like irrationality to the person still in the accumulation phase. Housel uses the story of Jesse Livermore to make this vivid. Livermore was one of the most successful stock traders in American history. In 1929, he correctly predicted the market crash and short-sold the entire market. On the day the stock market crashed and most investors lost everything, Livermore made $100 million. In today's money, that is roughly $1.4 billion. He was one of the richest men in the world. And 4 years later, he was broke. He had taken the same aggressive, leveraged, concentrated approach that had made him rich, and he had lost everything. He died by suicide in 1940. The lesson Housel draws is not that risk-taking is bad. It is that the skills that create wealth are different from the skills that preserve it. And the failure to recognize this transition, the inability to shift from accumulation mode to preservation mode at the right moment, has destroyed more fortunes than almost any market crash in history. He introduces what he calls the survival mindset, the idea that the most important financial skill is not maximizing returns. It is ensuring you never have to sell at the worst possible moment, never being forced out of the game, always having enough margin to survive the inevitable bad times that will come, regardless of how well your strategy is working. He calls this being financially unbreakable, and he argues that being unbreakable is more valuable than being brilliant. This connects to one of the most important and most overlooked ideas in the book, the concept of tail events. In finance and in life, the outcomes are not evenly distributed. A small number of events, a small number of decisions, a small number of investments account for the overwhelming majority of the results. Housel calls these tail events, and understanding them changes everything about how you think about risk, failure, and success. He uses the example of venture capital to make this concrete. The best venture capital funds in the world expect the majority of their investments to fail completely. They expect a significant portion to do okay, and they expect 1 or 2, maybe 1 in 50 or 1 in 100, to be absolutely massive, to return not 2 times the investment or 5 times, but 50 times, 100 times, 1,000 times. And that one tail investment, that single outlier, generates more returns than all the other investments combined. The implication for ordinary investors is profound. You are going to make financial decisions that do not work out. Some of your investments will lose money. Some of your business ideas will fail. Some of your career bets will not pay off. That is not evidence that your strategy is wrong. That is the natural distribution of outcomes in a world governed by tail events. The goal is not to avoid all failures. It is to stay in the game long enough for your tail events to arrive, to not be knocked out by a loss before the win that makes everything worth it finally shows up. Now let us talk about something that Housel explores with unusual honesty and unusual depth: the relationship between money and freedom. He argues that the highest form of wealth is not a number in a bank account. It is something far more personal and far more powerful. It is the ability to wake up in the morning and decide how you want to spend your day. He calls this the value of controlling your time. And he makes the case that the single largest source of human happiness, across all the research on well-being and life satisfaction, is the degree to which people feel they have autonomy over their time and their choices. Not income, not status, not possessions. Autonomy. The feeling that you are living your life on your own terms, that you are not trapped, that you have options. Housel points out the painful irony that most people pursue wealth in ways that destroy the very thing wealth is supposed to provide. They work 80-hour weeks to earn enough to retire comfortably. They sacrifice their health, their relationships, and their present happiness for a future freedom they may never live to enjoy. Or they earn the wealth and discover that the job they took to get there has locked them in, that they cannot leave because their lifestyle has expanded to match their income, that the golden handcuffs are still handcuffs. The practical wisdom here is one of the most important in the book. The goal of financial planning should not be a number. It should be a feeling. The feeling of having enough margin, enough options, enough security, that you are making choices about your time from a place of genuine freedom, rather than from a place of fear or obligation. And that feeling, Housel argues, can be achieved at a much lower income level than most people think, if you design your life deliberately enough. He introduces a concept here that reframes the entire question of lifestyle inflation. He calls it the invisible cost of wealth. We tend to admire wealthy people for their possessions, the car, the house, the watch, the private jet, but we rarely admire them for what those possessions actually represent, which is not success, but trade-offs. The person with the beautiful car traded something for it: time, stress, optionality, the ability to say no to work they do not want to do. We see the car. We do not see what was exchanged for it. Housel tells the story of Ronald Reed. Reed was a janitor in Vermont who worked at a gas station and a J.C. Penney store for most of his life. He wore a safety pin to hold his coat together because he did not want to buy a new one. He drove a used car. He lived in the same small house for decades. When he died in 2014, he left $8 million to his local library and hospital. He had built that fortune over a lifetime of quiet, consistent, patient investing. He never earned a high income. He never made a brilliant trade. He simply saved consistently, invested in blue-chip stocks, and let time do the work. At the same time, another man in the news that year was a high-earning professional who had declared bankruptcy. He had earned more in a single year than Ronald Reed had earned in his entire lifetime. But he had spent it all, and more. And his story is not unusual. It is, in fact, the far more common one. The contrast is the point. Wealth is what you do not spend. Wealth is the cars not purchased, the upgrades not taken, the impulses not acted on. Wealth is invisible by definition, because the moment you convert it into visible consumption, it is no longer wealth. It is consumption. And nobody gets wealthy through consumption. Now let us talk about something that most financial books either avoid entirely or handle with a kind of detached academic distance. Housel dives into it with genuine courage. He talks about the role of luck and risk in financial outcomes, and his argument is one of the most intellectually honest and morally important in the entire book. He opens with the story of Bill Gates. Gates went to Lakeside School in Seattle, one of the only high schools in the entire world at that time that had a computer terminal. The odds of a young person in 1968 attending a school with a computer terminal were roughly 1 in a million. Gates happened to be at that school. He happened to meet Paul Allen there. He happened to have the access, the time, and the environment to develop a passion for programming at exactly the right moment in history. Was Gates brilliant? Absolutely. Did he work extraordinarily hard? Without question. But did luck play a meaningful role in his becoming the richest person in the world? Housel says yes. And pretending otherwise does a disservice to everyone who is equally brilliant and equally hard-working, but was not at Lakeside School in 1968. He draws an equally important lesson from the other side of the equation. The same force that can make you wildly successful through no additional virtue of your own can destroy you through no particular fault of your own. The person who went bankrupt in 2008 was not necessarily less disciplined or less intelligent than the person who made a fortune in the same period. They were often in similar situations, making similar decisions, but one was touched by luck and one was touched by its absence. The practical implication is twofold. Number one, be careful about how much credit you take for your successes. Some of it is genuinely yours, and some of it is luck wearing the costume of skill. If you cannot tell the difference, you are likely to take risks in the future that are not actually justified by your skill level. Number two, be careful about how harshly you judge people who are struggling financially. Some of their situation is genuinely the result of their choices, and some of it is risk wearing the costume of failure. The humility to hold both of these truths simultaneously will make you wiser, kinder, and ultimately more financially resilient than either extreme on its own. Now let us talk about one of the most seductive and most dangerous ideas in personal finance. Housel calls it never enough, and he explores it through some of the most painful stories in the book. He tells the story of Rajat Gupta, who was born in poverty in Kolkata, India, rose to become the head of McKinsey, one of the most prestigious consulting firms in the world, sat on the boards of Goldman Sachs and Procter & Gamble, had a net worth of hundreds of millions of dollars, and was convicted of insider trading for trying to make a few more $1 million through illegal tips. He had more than almost anyone on earth, and it was not enough. The pursuit of more cost him everything he had built. He tells a similar story about Bernie Madoff. A man who was already legitimately wealthy, already respected, already successful beyond what most people ever dream of, who risked and ultimately lost everything, including his freedom and ultimately his relationship with his children, in pursuit of still more. Housel asks the question that these stories demand. At what point is enough enough? And he argues that the inability to answer that question clearly is one of the most destructive forces in financial life. Because the person who does not know what enough looks like will always be chasing more. And the chase for more leads to decisions that the person would never make if they stopped to ask whether the potential gain was worth the potential loss. He introduces a concept he calls the only financial skill that matters more than how much you earn. And that skill is knowing when to stop moving the goalposts. The ability to define enough in advance, to say, if I reach this point, I will be satisfied. I will not need more. Because the alternative, the constantly moving goalpost, the compulsive comparison with people who have more, the zero-sum thinking that sees every neighbor's success as a personal insult, is not just financially dangerous. It is psychologically corrosive. It makes you miserable, regardless of how much you accumulate. Social comparison is the engine of never enough. And Housel makes a point about it that is both obvious and devastating. You will never win the game of comparison. There is always someone with a bigger house, a faster car, a more impressive title, a larger portfolio. Always. So if your definition of enough is calibrated to what other people have, you will never reach it. The only workable definition of enough is an internal one, based on what you actually need to live the life that genuinely matters to you. Not the life that looks impressive from the outside, the life that feels right on the inside. Now let us talk about something that connects the personal to the practical in a very direct way. Housel talks about saving money with an insight that reframes the entire purpose of a savings account. He says you should save money, not for a specific goal, not for a house, a car, a vacation, a retirement. Build a savings buffer that has no specific purpose attached to it. Because the most valuable thing a savings account can give you is not a future purchase. It is options, flexibility, the ability to respond to the unexpected without being destroyed by it. He calls this savings without a spending goal. And the insight behind it is this: the future is uncertain in ways that are genuinely unpredictable. You do not know what opportunities will arise that you will want to capitalize on. You do not know what emergencies will arrive that you will need to absorb. You do not know how the economy will change, how your industry will shift, how your health will behave. What you do know is that having a financial buffer gives you the ability to navigate all of those unknowns from a position of strength rather than desperation. The person with 3 months of expenses saved makes decisions differently than the person with nothing saved. They can afford to say no to opportunities that do not feel right. They can afford to wait for the right job rather than taking the wrong one out of panic. They can absorb a car repair or a medical bill without going into debt. The savings do not just provide financial security. They provide psychological security. And that psychological security changes the quality of every financial decision you make. Now, let us talk about something that Housel addresses with unusual candor: the question of reasonable versus rational financial behavior. He makes a distinction that is subtle but enormously important. He says that purely rational financial behavior, the kind that maximizes expected returns according to economic theory, is often not the best behavior for actual human beings living actual human lives. He gives the example of diversification versus concentration. Pure financial theory says that a perfectly diversified portfolio is optimal. It minimizes unsystematic risk and maximizes risk-adjusted returns. This is mathematically correct, and yet many of the greatest fortunes in history were built through concentration, through betting heavily on a single company, a single industry, a single idea. This is not rational by the standards of modern portfolio theory, but it worked, because the human beings involved had information, conviction, and passion about their concentrated bets that a diversified investor simply does not have. His point is not that concentration is better than diversification. His point is that the best financial strategy is not the one that is theoretically optimal. It is the one you can actually stick to, the one that lets you sleep at night, the one that does not make you so anxious during a market downturn that you sell at exactly the wrong moment. A portfolio you can hold through a 50% crash is better than a theoretically superior portfolio you abandon when it drops 30%. He calls this the seduction of pessimism, and it connects to one of the most important behavioral insights in the book. Negative financial news always sounds smarter than positive financial news. When someone predicts a market crash, they sound serious, analytical, and sophisticated. When someone predicts continued growth, they sound naive or promotional. This asymmetry means that our media environment is structurally biased toward pessimism, and that constant diet of pessimism leads investors to make consistently terrible decisions. They sell when they should hold. They wait for the crash that never comes, while missing years of compounding. They confuse the sophistication of the prediction with the accuracy of it. Housel makes a powerful argument for what he calls long-term optimism combined with short-term paranoia. Be optimistic about the long-term direction of the economy, the market, and human ingenuity. History justifies this optimism overwhelmingly. Every crisis in human history has eventually been resolved. Every recession has eventually ended. Every bear market has eventually given way to a new bull market. But be paranoid about your short-term financial position. Have the cash reserves and the margin of safety to survive the inevitable bad periods without being forced to make desperate decisions. Now, let us come to what Housel considers perhaps the most important chapter in the entire book. He calls it room for error, and it is about one of the most underappreciated concepts in all of personal finance: the margin of safety. The margin of safety is a concept borrowed from engineering. When engineers design a bridge, they do not design it to hold exactly the weight they expect it to carry. They design it to hold far more. The extra capacity is the margin of safety. It is the buffer between what the bridge is expected to handle and what it can actually handle. Because the real world is always messier, more unpredictable, and more demanding than the models suggest. Housel argues that the most important financial decision most people can make is to build a significant margin of safety into every aspect of their financial life. Save more than you think you need to. Borrow less than you think you can afford. Diversify more than your current conviction warrants. Assume that the future will be harder, more expensive, and more volatile than your best-case scenario suggests. Not because you are pessimistic, but because history is unambiguous about one thing: the unexpected happens, always, to everyone. The question is whether you have the margin to absorb it when it does. He quotes the great engineer and systems thinker Nassim Taleb, who says that the purpose of a margin of safety is not to predict black swans. You cannot know in advance what will go wrong, but you can ensure that when something goes wrong, it does not take you out of the game permanently. That is the goal. Not to avoid all bad outcomes, to survive them. Now let us bring everything together, because The Psychology of Money is not really a book about investing, and it is not really a book about saving or budgeting or portfolio construction. It is a book about the relationship between human psychology and human financial behavior. It is a book about why we make the financial decisions we do, why those decisions often fail to serve our genuine interests, and what a more psychologically honest and behaviorally realistic approach to money actually looks like. Here is what you take from this book. No one is crazy. Every financial behavior, including the ones you find most baffling, make sense once you understand the personal history behind it. Your relationship with money was shaped by experiences you did not choose, in an era you did not select, in a family you did not design. Understanding that does not excuse poor financial behavior, but it is the beginning of changing it. Compounding rewards duration above almost everything else. The most powerful financial decision most people can make is to start early, stay consistent, and resist the temptation to interfere with the process. Getting wealthy and staying wealthy require different skills. The aggressive optimism that builds wealth can destroy it if it is not balanced with the humility and preservation mindset of someone who has something to protect. Tail events dominate outcomes. A small number of decisions and a small number of investments will account for the overwhelming majority of your financial results. The goal is to stay in the game long enough for your tail events to arrive. Wealth is what you do not spend. The invisible accumulation of unconsumed income, compounding quietly over time, is the only path to genuine financial independence. Luck and risk are real. Take less credit for your successes and have more compassion for others and their failures. Define enough in advance, or you will spend your life moving goalposts and never arrive anywhere worth arriving. Save not for a specific goal, but for the optionality that savings provide. Be reasonable rather than purely rational. The best financial strategy is the one you can actually maintain through the inevitable chaos of a real human life. And build a margin of safety into everything, not because you can predict what will go wrong, but because something always does. And the people who survive the unexpected with their wealth and their sanity intact are the ones who built enough slack in the system to absorb it. Housel closes the book with a reflection that is quietly profound. He says that managing money well has less to do with how smart you are and more to do with how you behave. And behavior is hard to teach even to very smart people. But it is learnable. It is improvable. And every small improvement in how you behave around money, compounded over a lifetime, produces results that are genuinely extraordinary. You now know what most people never figure out, that money is not primarily a mathematical problem. It is a psychological one. And the person who solves the psychological problem will always outperform the person who only solved the mathematical one. The question is not whether you know enough about money. You know enough. The question is whether you are willing to be honest about how you actually behave around it. And whether you are willing to close the gap between the financial decisions you know you should make and the ones you actually make, when fear, greed, comparison, and impatience are all pulling in the other direction. That gap, and your willingness to close it, is the whole game.